Hello and welcome to today's webinar from Valto that's titled Governance and Security in SharePoint Online Intranets. My name is Dougie Wood and I'm a Microsoft MVP in the Microsoft Office 365 Applications and Services category. So my main speciality is talking about SharePoint, and in today's webinar we're going to go in depth about the different levels of security that's available inside of SharePoint. The reason why we're talking about this is because a lot of people aren't really certain if their SharePoint is properly enabled for security controls, and they're not too sure who can see what and the different options they have available to them when it comes to securing their SharePoint Online Intranets. So there's a number of common scenarios that often lead people down the path of coming to talk to Valto about SharePoint security. Common scenarios including IT dependency. So sometimes there might even be a third-party IT company which is maintaining the security of your SharePoint intranet, but they're just slow to act. So Valto are often approached by customers that are frustrated by the rate in which their current IT support will act around their SharePoint environment. Other common scenarios is maybe the complete opposite. There's no support at all. This is much more likely to affect smaller or medium-sized businesses. But who do you ask? Perhaps you currently do not have a support agreement which includes SharePoint, but you need assistance. It's a very common situation that you might have IT support, but it's very generic, and the people that are managing your IT support are generalists rather than specialists, and SharePoint is a bit of a specialist area. It's seen in a lot of the IT industry as a bit of a dark art, and to get it right does require a certain level of understanding and experience to make sure that things are properly secure. Another area is general kind of education. So people come to us because they're just not educated in how SharePoint is supposed to work. And this might have come from that you've recently had a SharePoint intranet deployed or maybe a year or so ago, and there was no materials, there was no handover, there was no training, or maybe some refresher materials are needed to look over. Maybe, and I mean, this is a really common scenario that we see, is, and you might find yourself in one of these positions, but having an ex-contractor, this is really common. So what I call not a team player. They turn up, they do a SharePoint project, and then they vanish into the night. It's a very common issue, having a contractor setting things up like an intranet and then leaving, and nobody really knows how to use it or maintain it or administer it, and they're not really sure. Maybe there's poor documentation around it and things like that. So these are all scenarios which kind of lead down this path of considering, is my SharePoint truly secure and set up and configured the way that I would assume it should be? So before we talk too much about the specifics of SharePoint itself, what I wanted to do was talk a little bit about what the different security roles are involved with SharePoint. So before we even get to the level of where we're talking about the SharePoint site, it's worth knowing about the Microsoft 365 roles which play a part in the overarching SharePoint security. So I'm going to basically describe this from the top down. So the very top of the Christmas tree of the sort of security architecture. And then I'm going to give you the key roles and permissions which sit underneath them and what they do. So at the end of this webinar, you should have a much clearer idea about who should have what role. So the first is about a global admin. Now this is the very top tier. This is essentially the God mode of Microsoft 365. And inside of Microsoft 365, SharePoint is just one of many products. So a global admin is somebody who has access to all of those products, including the likes of Teams and Exchange for your emails and Power Platform. There's loads of different areas that they can then get inside of, and SharePoint is just one of those. Now, typically the global admin role is given to IT staff, so whether it's internally or externally. If it is given externally, I would recommend that someone at least in-house has that access. So if you ever to switch supplier or something was to happen and you needed to get access, you should also have one of these roles in-house. You shouldn't have too many of them, so ideally only a few of these accounts should exist, because it's a bit of a security almost risk to have too many of them. If every man and his dog's got this permission, then it's really putting your whole infrastructure at risk. In a smaller business, you do tend to find that, say for example, you're in a 10 to 20 employee company, it's probably whoever originally set up the Microsoft 365 tenant who's got the global admin role. So quite often we work with smaller organizations where it's the managing director, for example, who's maybe gone about setting this up, and they are the person who has the global admin role. So as I say, it accesses all areas of Microsoft 365 apps and data. You can only be given, so you can only get this role by either creating the Microsoft 365 tenancy yourself. So if you created the full 365 tenant yourself, you'll likely have this role to start with, or it's given to you by another global admin. It has access to all the admin centers, not just SharePoint. Obviously, it includes SharePoint, but it has access to all the other areas. So if you're looking to be given a high privilege level and it's only really for SharePoint, then global admin is overkill. You shouldn't have that. The global admin role does include the SharePoint admin role. So this is the next layer down from this. So underneath that, the next layer down is the SharePoint admin role. So as I say, this role is one of, I can't remember off the top of my head, but maybe 6 roles which makes up the global admin role. So the SharePoint admin role is given to people to access the SharePoint admin center. So if you're going to be in charge of the not just one SharePoint site or the intranet homepage, but every single SharePoint site, including all of the SharePoint sites which sit at the back of Microsoft Teams, then you will need this admin role. Again, it's typically only given to IT staff, and they can access all SharePoint sites. So although you were given the role, you do have to still go in and individually add yourself into SharePoint sites that you're not already an owner of. However, you can just have free reign of every single SharePoint site. So again, if this doesn't sound like the type of role that you should have, or you're thinking of giving to a colleague, then make sure that it's only given to people that should have that full access to everything. Now, these people can create brand new SharePoint sites, they can delete any SharePoint sites, and they can give themselves site collection admin access, which is what we're going to talk about as the next major permission inside of SharePoint. So just to reiterate, again, this is usually only given to IT staff at a high level who should be basically in charge of the whole of SharePoint. So whether it's a sort of SharePoint administrator type role inside of the organization, those are the types of people that should have that level of access. In a smaller, medium-sized business, again, you might see that there might be somebody who is not necessarily their full day job has this role, but they do need to be able to get in and manage SharePoint at a high level. So then it brings us down to the SharePoint permissions. So the SharePoint permissions are set individually per site. So site permissions are specific to every single SharePoint site, but can also be inherited from the site above it in the structure known as the hub site. So the roles that we were looking at before, and I'm very careful to try and change my terminology, that the first set we were just looking at are Microsoft 365 roles. They're given in the admin center in the background, in the user admin center of Microsoft 365. And they are a kind of back-end type of role that's getting you into the SharePoint Admin Center, seeing all the different SharePoint sites that's in the whole of your tenant. Whereas the SharePoint permissions are specifically assigned to individual SharePoint sites. Now, I don't want to get overly complicated, but you can inherit permissions from other sites as well. So you could, your hub site, think of that as like your intranet homepage. And on some of our other webinars, we've talked about hub sites, or if you're not too sure what a hub site is, go onto YouTube after this and just search for SharePoint hub sites and you'll find loads of information about what a hub site is. But in short, it's essentially your homepage of your intranet. So you can decide what your permissions are at that level, and then any sites which are associated to that can inherit those permissions as well, which makes it much easier if you're trying to give, say, everyone read access to your whole intranet rather than specifying that on every single site. So before we can get into the 3 core SharePoint permissions, there is a layer which is called the SharePoint Site Collection Admin. Now, this isn't seen, if you were to, and I'll show you in a demo in a moment, but if we were to click on the cog, the top right corner of SharePoint, and then go to the SharePoint permissions, this is the panel which slides out. And this is what I would refer to as almost like the day-to-day SharePoint permissions. And you can see here we've got site owners with full control, site members, site visitors, and so on. You don't actually see the site collection admins in here. You have to click on the advanced permissions settings. And then when you get to the next page, there'll be a little bar across the top which says site collection admins. And they're kept separate from the day-to-day permissions. The reason being is that these people, well, first of all, let's talk about what they can do. So they can create things. They can update things, they can delete things, they can add permission levels to the site, to groups, things like that. But they can never be locked out of any pages or files. Now, this is really important. This is the key difference between this layer and the next layer down, which is a full control layer. They can never be locked out of anything. So again, this kind of permission level is essentially given to either the main stakeholder of the SharePoint site, so the person who's always going to stay in charge of the site and get involved if things go a bit pear-shaped, or it's given to IT staff. Now, if you have the role above the site collection admin, which is the SharePoint admin role that we saw on the last slide, you can give yourself SharePoint site collection admin at any time to any of the sites. So you don't have to have it, you can give yourself that retrospectively. The reason being is then if, say, for example, somebody was a site collection admin and they left the organization, then the SharePoint admin role essentially trumps that and can come in and give somebody else that level of access to come in and start using the site and pick up where the last person left off. So the next layer down from that is full control. Now, again, this is very similar in terms of the SharePoint site collection admin, in terms of that they can create everything, as in not just files and folders, but also document libraries, image libraries, loads of different types of content on your SharePoint site. And they can have full control over how it looks and feels and change the layout and colors and all that sort of stuff. They can add full control permission levels to others, so they can give other people full control permissions. The only difference, realistically, between a full control user and a site collection admin is that they can be locked out by other full control users or site collection admins. So let's say, for example, if you are a full control user and I am a full control user, I could create a folder called Dougie's folder and lock you out of it. So I could, and we're going to look at this later on in creating folder permissions, but I could lock you out of that. And as a full control user, there's nothing you can do about it. You cannot get access to that folder. So let's say, for example, if I then left the organization, you wouldn't be able to have access to that folder to see the documents or the things I've been working on. So you'd need to contact the SharePoint site collection admin to ask them to give you access to that folder. Because although I've locked out everybody else, and even the permissions to a certain extent will look like only I have access to that folder, in fact, the SharePoint site collection admin can see everything, as they can never be locked out of any content on that particular SharePoint site. So that's the full control users. The next layer down from that is limited control, which means they have edit access. And previously in other sort of SharePoint kind of years gone by, you might have heard of them called as contributors as well, or contributor access, which I quite like that, because the idea of this is that you're contributing or editing content and a structure which already exists. So you can create new content, you can create new news articles and pages, update things, delete things. Again, you can be locked out by other users. And for most instances, there's minimal difference between this and full control. So quite often, if I'm trying to keep the permissions quite simplistic and I'm talking to organizations about keeping it as simple as possible, then I would almost tend to ignore the limited control permission and give users either full control access to a SharePoint site or the no control, which is the next layer down, which is read, because there's not a huge amount of difference between limited control and full control. So it's sometimes easier for people to understand the extremes of things, the full control versus no control, than it is to try and explain three separate groupings. So the next layer down from this is the no control. So this is a little bit misleading in a sense, because actually what it means is it's not that you don't have any access, that you've got no access at all. It means that you have read access. And actually I prefer referring to this as read-only access, because then it's exactly what it says on the tin. You can open things, you can download things, and you can read things. You can be locked out by others, and you must have at least this access to even see the site. So if you've gone to a SharePoint site in the past before, and you've got a big message that popped up that said, sorry, you don't have access to this site, it's because you don't have any form of permission. Not even this no control / read only access to the SharePoint site. So you have to be given that in order to access the SharePoint site. So let's quickly jump in and I'll show you how we can add permissions to a SharePoint site. Okay, so this is my SharePoint site. It's a communication site and I'm going to give somebody access to the SharePoint site now. So first things you need to do is click on the cog across the top right hand corner. This pop-out box will then appear and you'll see roughly in the middle of this list we've got site permissions. Now by clicking on site permissions, this will show you the permissions for this site. You can also see the permissions for the hub. So because this is my hub site, meaning this is the top of my intranet and other sites are going to inherit from this, I could also say sync hub permissions to associated sites. I could turn this on if I wanted to. So this will allow me then to control the permissions from this hub site downwards if I wanted to. But I'm just going to show you something a bit more simplistic. How do you add somebody? So to add somebody, all we need to do is click on this SharePoint site, and then we can type in somebody's name or their email address. I'm going to type in someone's name. So I'm going to just type in Jade, and then from this drop down, I can see her name. Now, to give them the different access, we need to click on this drop down here, and we've got full control and we've got edit. So if you remember, full control is has access to everything. Edit is very similar to full control, just a slightly cut down version. And read is read only. So I'm going to say I'm going to give full control to Jade. Now we also get the option of sending an email. So if we wanted to send an email, this would essentially push through a templated email with a personalized message. So I might just say, this is a test, and then click on add. Now what that will do is it will now add Jade under the site owners. So you can now see Jade is underneath the site owners of this particular SharePoint site. We can move her between the different groups. So site owners is the SharePoint group, which has got full control. Site members is the group which has got limited control, which is the edit. And site visitors is the group which has got read-only access to it. So I can move between groups at any time by clicking the drop down and then say moving it to the edit group, which will then put it in here. You can also remove people at any time by clicking the drop down and click on remove, and that will then remove them. Now, this is purely just working on the basis that you're adding individual users. Now, if you're in a small or medium-sized business, you might want to be very specific and granular with who you're giving access to at this SharePoint site level. But in a larger organization, or definitely even enterprise, you will need to be a bit more specific at using groups rather than individual users, because individual users just becomes a bit of a mess. If you get someone who leaves the organization, it's a bit of a nightmare to then go and have to remove them from each of those different areas, rather than removing them from one group that then removes them from all of the different SharePoint sites. We'll talk a bit more about groups later on in this webinar. But you can see that's as simple as it is to add somebody to a SharePoint site permission. However, it starts getting a little bit more complicated when you start thinking about restricting down the areas that you want people to have access to. So you can restrict SharePoint down at multiple areas, multiple layers of SharePoint. So if you think about SharePoint as a kind of structure, you've got the site layer. So on that site, we were just looking at a SharePoint site called the Hub. Inside the Hub, there is a document library. Now, every single SharePoint site has at least one document library just called Documents. But you can create more document libraries if you wanted to. So you can break the permissions at that document library level. You can then also break it down further at the folder level or even the file level if you wanted to. Now, the way everything works in SharePoint is everything's inheriting from the thing above it. So the file inherits its permissions from the folder inherits its permissions from the document library, and the document library inherits its permissions from the SharePoint site. But you can break that chain at any point. Now, another way I like to show and teach people this is actually by looking at the URL of SharePoint. So let me just flick back to my site. So now I've jumped into a specific folder inside of my SharePoint site. And now the URL won't look essentially like this. We can always get to this document by using this URL, but I've just overly simplified this URL. When I refresh the page, you would see a whole load of gobbledygook come out. But I wanted to kind of show you, if you were to send this link to somebody, this would take you to this open up this particular document. But I find it quite useful to try and explain to people the different layers of SharePoint so you can understand at what layer you can choose to stop the permissions inheritance and then create a whole new set of permissions from that point onwards to restrict who can access it. So if you consider, so this bit here, this valtolimited.sharepoint.com, this is the SharePoint tenant name. Now, there's no kind of permissions applied at this level, so don't worry about that. Everything else is after the sites, so you want to focus on after the sites area. So the Intranet hub is the name of my SharePoint site. So this is where the permissions start. This is that permissions list we were looking at before when we click on the cog and then site permissions. It's setting it at that layer. Then the next layer down is the shared documents, which is the name of this document library that I'm currently inside of, and all of the files and folders which are contained within it. And in fact, actually, there's multiple folders in here that has. So actually, my URL is wrong. It should be Beth Smith like this. So then we're at the folder level. So this is now the folder level of Beth Smith. And again, we could change the permissions at this layer as well if we wanted to. And then the final layer is the document itself, and we could change the permissions of that layer. So hopefully you can now see this is how the inheritance works. It's feeding kind of its permissions downwards until we say stop. So it could be, let's say for example, I've got access to the SharePoint site as a full control user, and you have got access to this site as a full control user. You might also have access to this document library as a full control user, and I do as well. But then I decide from this point onwards, only myself has access to this Beth Smith folder. Maybe she's an employee that I manage, for example, and she doesn't report to you, she reports to me. So I've changed the permissions so only I see this. And then of course, all of the files then which live inside of this particular folder also inherit that permission. So it means that you can't access any of these file level documents either. So before I go back to giving you a demonstration of how we actually restrict it at folder level, I just want to talk a little bit about the restrictions and what they mean, some best practices, and my experience of it. So from my experience, the more granular you get with your permissions, the more admin time it's going to create. And there's no real way around that. It's just a fact of life that the more granular you make it. So say, for example, we're going to have a folder for each employee, and if they were to leave, we're going to have to change their permissions and all that sort of stuff. That can get quite admin heavy. Now, you might work out that the time invested into that, the return on investment is worth it. The security versus the admin time is worth it. But it's something to consider. So a lot of people I see go down the route of thinking, yeah, we'll restrict everything within an inch of its life. But they don't really consider what the outcome of that is going to be, which is going to be a lot of administration time. So unless there's anything that's really sensitive, now the example I'm going to give is going back to that folder level permissions where, again, it's sometimes we see it with our HR department might have a folder per employee, and only the HR team, the employee and the employee's line manager can have access to the documents in there because they're sensitive, right? They're personal development plans, they're maybe warnings and things like that, and sensitive information. So it makes sense that not everyone in the organization should have access to those. But when you think of a broader kind of SharePoint site, like maybe you're using it for policies and procedures and things like that, maybe don't go too nuts with who can access, who can edit, who can control and things like that. Maybe just give a slightly more broad brush approach And that's why I say ideally site permissions is the easiest way to maintain it. So focusing on the site layer rather than all the things which come underneath it is always going to be the easiest way to maintain it. And in fact, you'll see in a moment that the interface, I think, for the SharePoint site permissions is slightly easier to use and more simplistic than it is to go down into all these other layers. So as I say, it's not too easy to see who has access. And sometimes I get the question from people to say, well, can you just spit out a report which shows every single, like if I was to say, this one person, Joe Bloggs, what has he got access to everything inside of SharePoint? The short answer is no, not really. You can do some manual digging and investigations, and you can put some of those things together, but there's not really, without using third-party tools, any easy way to say, this person has got these levels of access to these files and folders and things like that, and it can get quite challenging to keep on top of that. So again, it comes back to that original point of the granularity of it causes more administration time. It's also worth thinking about what happens if someone leaves. So is it the end of the world if someone leaves? Have you got your SharePoint structure in a way that if someone was to leave tomorrow, let's say, God forbid, somebody was hit by a bus or something like that, or just couldn't turn up to work, would the restrictions in place currently prevent work from continuing? And do you have a kind of backup plan that someone could get access to those files or folders if such a crisis was to occur? AKA, do you have a SharePoint admin role? So what we're saying there is you really need to have somebody who, maybe it's not necessarily even the IT staff, but somebody who has got the role ready to go, that if they needed to, they can get access. Now, the SharePoint admin role will mean that they can go into the SharePoint Admin Center, find the SharePoint site, give themselves site collection admin to be able to go in and find the files, and then maybe share it with the relevant colleagues that need access to those files. So again, just take into consideration that the short story is the more granular it is, the more admin time. And it doesn't necessarily mean that you shouldn't be doing lower levels. I would really probably try and avoid going too far down the line of having something that's a big spaghetti spider web of permissions. But it really does depend on the scenario. But for most people using SharePoint as an intranet tool, keeping it really simple at site permissions level is the best way forward. So let's jump in and talk a little bit about creating restricted folders. As I say, it's not always possible to just keep permissions at the SharePoint site level. And that's why I'm running this webinar, to try and help people understand the different options, the different things you have available to you, so that you can make an informed decision. So a common scenario that I see is things like HR departments having a folder for every employee, and they want to be able to give access to the employee, and they want to be able to give access to their line manager, for example, and sort of share that with them. So that often comes from having a folder which is then given folder level permissions inside of SharePoint, and then it's shared out to those relevant stakeholders. So I've got a list of employee folders here, and in fact, as a side note, there's bonus points for anyone who can name what TV show all of these names have come from as folders. If you know, post it in the comments below. And yeah, mega brownie points if you can tell me what that is. So let's create a new folder. So if I click on new, click on folder, and then I'm going to create a new employee folder. So again, I'm going to create one for Jade. Buckley. And we'll give a purple folder. So this is actually something new as well, actually, that SharePoint and OneDrive are allowing you now to color code your folders as well, which is quite nice. So if you wanted to group things together by a color, it's quite useful. So click on create. So there we go, I've got our folder created. So now to change the permissions of this, we're going to click on this little tick here, and then we've got this little icon on the right hand side here, which is the details pane. It's like an eye inside of a circle. If you click on that, you can then see has access and manage access. By clicking that, we can then see who has access. So we can see individual people, and we can see groups that have access. So by default, the owners will have the sort of full control, visitors have read only, and members have the edit permissions. Now we can change this. So if I was to click on this, I can choose to say remove direct access. So we can remove those accesses that these groups have. Now, I'm a little bit old school to a certain extent with SharePoint, and you can have more access and I think more clearer controls by clicking on these three dots up here and click on advanced settings. So if you're just looking just to sort of have a high level user interface, this is quite a good way of seeing who you're sharing this with and the groups that have access to it and the shared links that have been sent out from this particular folder. But if you're wanting to have a bit more control, click on the three dots across the top and click on advanced settings. This takes you to the kind of classic view of the permissions, but I find it easier to understand. Now, I might just be a bit old school in this kind of way. But you can see now that I've removed that grouping, it's already set this to be delete unique. It's already set this to be unique permissions. But actually, if I just go back a step, and if I just go into, let's just go into, for example, Morty, and we go into I'll show you, if we click on manage access, and then I'm going to go to the advanced settings of this, you'll actually see that it's inheriting the permissions by default. So if you've not made any changes and you want to use this interface, you must click on the stop inheriting permissions. Then click on OK. Now remember, I'm inside the Morty folder now rather than the Jade folder. Now let's say, for example, I want to remove everybody from this. So I'm going to remove everybody from this grouping. Now, before I do that, a little top tip before you do that, make sure that you're either site collection admin or you give yourself direct permission to this. The reason being is you can log yourself out of this folder you've just created. So I would click on grant permissions and give yourself access to this if you don't already have access. So let me just refresh this page. Click on grant access. I'm just going to type in my name because I'm not too sure off the top of my head if I give myself site collection admin. So I'm going to say I've got full control permission and I'm sharing everything, including unique items. So there we go. So now if I refresh, and through this interface you will need to refresh to see the changes being made. Now we can see I definitely have access as a full control user. So now if I remove these groupings, click on remove, and now it's just myself who has access. So maybe let's say, for example, we're also wanting to give someone else access to this. So let's say, for example, we're going to give Steve access, and we're going to give him full control as well. And so he can upload files and folders to this folder. And let's just say we're going to give somebody else. So let's say Sam, and we're going to give him read-only access to this folder. So he should only be able to see the documents in there, but not upload, edit, or delete any of them as well. So now we've got these three people have got access to that folder. Now, the other thing to mention about folder level permissions is that only now these three people will actually see that folder. So anybody else in the organization won't even see that folder exists. If they go into that, that's the beauty of the folder level permissions. If they were to go into this particular document library, they would only see the files and folders that they have access to. So I have access to all of these files and folders, so I actually see all of them. Whereas actually, if I was only to have access to my own folder and people who report to me, I could call this, say, for example, my department's folders or files something, and it would make sense because I would only be able to see the files and folders for myself and my department employees that report to me as well. So that's creating restricted areas such as folders. But again, you can do the same thing at the file level using the same interface. And you can also break down the document library permissions as well. Slightly different interface for that, but you can probably find some materials on that online if you really wanted to do that. So again, the key message of this is the more granular you make it, the more admin time there is going to be. Next thing to talk about then is how to use groups. Now, there are three key types of groups to be aware of. and each of them have their own pros and cons. So the first type of group to think about is a SharePoint group. Now we've already seen the examples of the out-of-the-box standard groups, which are the owners, the members, and the visitors. So owners having full control, the members having the edit control, and the visitors just having read control. So those are the out-of-the-box ones, but you can also go and create your own SharePoint groups as well. You can do this quite simply. If you do have a site collection admin role or a full control user role, you can click on the cog across the top, click on site permissions, click on advanced permission settings, which takes you to the classic view of the permissions, and then click on create group. This will then guide you through creating a brand new group. So let's say this is, we're creating a SharePoint group called HR admins. So these are the people that we might want to drop into those folders to make sure that they can access the employee records as well. So as I scroll down, you can see there's a couple of different options here. So you can say who can view the membership of this group, only group members or everyone. Who can edit the membership of this group, the group owner or the group members. So group members will mean that other members will be able to add other members into this as well. Or you can say just the person who's a group owner that's creating this. You can also allow requests to join or leave the group. So if somebody thinks they should be able to access it, they can do. And you can also choose whether you want to auto accept requests to this. And if there are requests, where do you want those emails, notifications for requests to go to? Then the final thing here is to select what permission level you want someone to have access. So we've talked about full control, we've talked about edit, we've talked about read, and now there's a couple of other ones in here. Again, there's variations, subtle variations of those three. So I don't want to go into too much detail. If you are interested in these, you can come back and you can take a look at these, but they're just subtle variations. Let's say, for example, I actually just want to give full control to this group. Click on create. So that's now created me my SharePoint group. I can now start adding people into this group if I wanted to. Let's say, for example, let's add Jade. Let's add Sam. And then we can click on share. And that'll then add those people into groupings for me. So now I've got myself a SharePoint admin group. I can then use this back inside of my folders. So let's say, for example, we want to go back into that multi folder, and we're going to go back into the manage access. We're going to go on to groups, and we can either click on share with a group from here, or back inside of the advanced settings, we can come and we can click on grant permissions and then search for that grouping. So HR admins, click on that, and then click on share. Now that then will give everybody, if I just refresh, everyone in that grouping, I think we set it to edit here. Now, if I wanted to change that, I can always click on this, click on edit user permissions, and let's bump that up to full control. Click on OK. There we go. So now everybody in that HR admins group has got full control to this multi-folder. So I can add and remove HR people from that folder without having to then add them individually to each employee folder. So if a HR admin was to leave the organization, I can remove them from that SharePoint group, and it will remove them from all the employee folders as well. So you can see then it makes it much easier to maintain who has access to that, and removes a certain degree of administration time from the granularity of these folder level permissions. The second type of grouping is the Entra ID, which formerly was Azure AD, security enabled groups. Now it does have to be a security enabled group. It can't just be a distribution list, because that is just a list of email addresses. It has to be security enabled. Now, these are created typically by your IT department, but you can go into the admin center. So if you do have, say, the global admin role that we talked about at the very beginning, you can go into office.com, click on the admin tile, go to groups, create a new security enabled group, and you can create a group there. Now, then adding that into a file folder or SharePoint site is exactly the same as what we looked at before, that when we were adding that SharePoint group. There's no difference to the user interface. You just type the name of the group that you've created and then it appears. So the only difference between creating a SharePoint group and a security-enabled group from Azure ID, or now known as Entra ID, is the fact that the security-enabled group that's created in Entra ID can be used for other things outside of SharePoint, and it's cross SharePoint sites. So say, for example, if I was to create a Azure AD group that was called HR admins, I can use it on every single SharePoint site. I can also use that in other areas like Microsoft Teams and all sorts of different things, scenarios inside of Microsoft 365. Whereas a SharePoint group is only specific to the current SharePoint site that you're looking at. So in fact, it can't be used on a different SharePoint site, and it can't be used for anything outside of SharePoint either. So you might ask, well, why bother with SharePoint groups at all? So SharePoint groups are really useful if you want to give the control of the security of your SharePoint site or intranet to a non-IT team member, so like a stakeholder from a department or something like that, and it's minimizing the risk of someone accidentally getting access to something, for example. And it also takes away the admin time from the IT staff who has to constantly maintain who has access to what on a certain SharePoint site. And to a certain extent, larger enterprise companies, this is pretty much the only way with SharePoint groups that it kind of works, because unless you're really granular with the security in terms of the AD groups and things like that, quite often there becomes a need for almost like in a department to manage certain levels of access of their own SharePoint sites. So that's where SharePoint groups becomes really useful, because you don't have to have anything more than, say, for example, the full control permission to a SharePoint site, which is mitigating the risk of you having to have access to these Entra ID Azure AD groups. So between those first two, it really comes down to who you see managing those groups going forward. Who's governing those groups is going to determine whether or not you have these security-enabled groups or you have SharePoint groups. So if it's going to be IT department, probably best that you use security-enabled groups. If it's going to be stakeholders from a department or non-IT staff, it might be better to use SharePoint groups. So those are different options. Again, everyone's scenarios are slightly different, and there's no right or wrong answer necessarily. It's just how it's going to be administered going forward. And then the final group, which I like to make sure people know about, because not everybody does know about this. There's a default SharePoint group, which is called Everyone Except External Users. Now, what this means is everybody who is licensed for SharePoint inside of your Microsoft 365 tenant is automatically added into that grouping, and you can then use that group inside of SharePoint, maybe to give everyone read access. Now, you might have seen, if you had an eagle eye before, that I was using that on one of my demo examples before. So let's take a look. So back in the permissions area of my SharePoint site, you can see under site visitors, I've already added this everyone except external users. And all I've done is I've gone into SharePoint site, permissions box, typed in everyone, selected the everyone group, and then given it read access. Now, this is a great way to give say you're launching a brand new SharePoint intranet and you want to give everyone access, rather than creating security groups, or even worse than that, giving individually named people access to the SharePoint site, which can take a long time. You can just drop that group in. So everyone except external users dropped into there and they have access. But just be aware that literally means everyone in the organization. I have dealt with in the past before SharePoint sites which have used this, and then for whatever reason, maybe there's been external parties or people that are licensed, but they shouldn't necessarily see all the information inside of the organization's intranet. They were accessed and they couldn't figure out why these people had access through to the SharePoint site. And it's because this group was being used. So although they were technically external people, maybe, I can't remember exactly the scenario, I think they were suppliers or something like that, but they had their own email address, passwords for Microsoft 365, and they were licensed for SharePoint to come into SharePoint. And to a certain extent, they were accessing certain areas of SharePoint, but they shouldn't have been accessing the company intranet. And they did have access to it, and they were seeing notifications and things like that because they were accessing it via this particular group. So those are the core types of groups that you can use for controlling and governing your SharePoint security. Then the next thing to talk about is external sharing with SharePoint. Now, SharePoint can have external sharing enabled, meaning you can give third-party permissions to your SharePoint site. Now, this does require a SharePoint admin role to enable. They go into the background of the admin center, under the sharing policies, they'll see some sliders like this, and you've got a couple of different options that you can enable for both SharePoint and OneDrive. They're both bundled into the same external sharing policy area. You can either say only people in your organization, which is the default, which means no external sharing is allowed. You can specify existing guests, so only users already in your organization's directory. So people can't just randomly add new guests. They have to make sure they go through a properly governed process to make sure that a guest account is created and then shared to a particular SharePoint site. Or you can say new and existing guests. So guests must sign in and provide a verification code. So a guest basically is somebody who you have to be pretty sure you know who they are, essentially. They have to have a profile created as a guest, and you can then share it to them. Now, those profiles can be created almost on the fly in terms of if they're new guests using this particular level, you can just share with, say, dougie.wood@outlook.com, and that's an external email address. It sends me an email. I can then verify that it's me. It creates almost like a temporary mini guest profile inside of our Active Directory, and then I can access SharePoint through that. But again, guests must sign in and provide a verification code. Then the final kind of most loose option is this anyone, which means users can share files and folders using links that don't require sign-in, which means that you have full anonymous access to that SharePoint files and folders. Now, this should only be given to certain SharePoint sites. And in fact, actually, once the SharePoint admin role user has enabled this, it doesn't automatically apply to all of your SharePoint sites. You have to then go in and categorically say which SharePoint sites will have external access. And you can actually specify different layers of access for different sites. One site might be internal only, one might be complete anonymous, one might be existing guests. This policy is basically just saying what is the maximum, what is the furthest you're willing to take your security controls inside of SharePoint, and then you apply those levels to individual SharePoint sites afterwards. So this external sharing is perfect for self-service portals. I've seen them used for like customer portals where customers are logging in and getting a more personalized customer experience, where they can kind of see information which is relevant to them, news and events which is relevant to them, and things like that. Or partners where people are working together, and maybe there's going to be a new product launch that you want your partners to know about ahead of time, and you're telling them the month before so they can prepare and they can go to their partner portal to download the latest materials and sales documents and things like that. Or maybe it's for suppliers, so maybe you're requesting something and they can provide proposals and drop them off inside of your dedicated SharePoint area. So it becomes this kind of personalized drop-off / collection of files area inside of SharePoint, which is really useful. And it prevents file size issues instead of email. So Valto actually did a project about a year ago. I'm going to be careful what I say because of NDAs and things like that. But we did a project with the public sector where they had a bit of a problem where people needed to submit applications for things which contained a lot of detail, a lot of information. And it was being done, sent by CD-ROMs, actually, CD disks into the public sector organization. And that's because the amount of information was far too big to send in an email or anything like that, and it was just a long-winded process. So instead, we set them up with a SharePoint site, which was externally sharing. Now, there was a lot of bells and whistles added to this, that we did things like we automated the folder permissions and things like that. We automated how long the external sharing was enabled for, and it would cut off after a certain period of time and things like that. But this was all using out-of-the-box SharePoint features and then elevating that with Power Automate to bring some level of automation to it. But essentially, it's all providing a secure, all-in-one place that you can access. And even better, you can use this type of functionality to replace maybe things that you're paying for as a third party, like WeTransfer, or maybe it's something that your organizations using things like G Drive or any of these third-party platforms to share externally. So if what I tend to find is, unless you provide a platform for your staff and your organization to share content externally, there's always a need to share and retrieve data externally. And if you don't provide them that platform, they'll go out and find it themselves, which means that you lose the governance, the control, and the security of your data because people are just willy-nilly putting it all over the place. Whereas actually you could dedicate a SharePoint site for that. So a top tip on this is have a dedicated named extranet SharePoint site. Have a SharePoint site called extranet or external blah 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 or sharing of blah blah blah. Make it obvious that that's what that SharePoint site is for. As I say, you can make just one SharePoint site this external sharing if you wanted to, and lock everything else down. And if you have that one site and it's called something obvious like extranet or external sharing portal or something along those lines, it's much more obvious and it cuts down and mitigates the risk of someone sharing something that they shouldn't. Because if you open up the whole of SharePoint for external sharing, then you potentially run into the issues of something being shared that shouldn't be. Whereas that one SharePoint site will restrict that. It means that someone has to go purposefully to that area to share out something externally. And it keeps all under one roof. Now, once you've enabled this external sharing, adding permissions to that SharePoint site is exactly the same as if we were to be adding it from an employee. You do typically have to type in their email address rather than their name, obviously. But just typing in like dougie.wood@outlook.com as an external email address to my Valto tenant, that will come up and it'll prompt you and it'll say, this person's outside of your organization, so it knows it's outside of it. And depending on that SharePoint site and what level of access it will have, it'll either completely block it if it won't allow it. It might flag to say this person isn't a guest and you need to have them added as a guest by your IT team first, or create a new existing guest, or it can just be shared to anybody regardless. So it'll prompt you and walk you through that. But essentially, once it's enabled for external sharing, sharing it to other people is exactly like adding permissions for internal staff. So I wouldn't be doing my job if I wasn't then trying to tell you how Valto can specifically help you with these challenges. So Valto offers a SharePoint Intranet Workshop, which can be tailored to the needs that you currently have. If you're watching this, you probably already have some level of SharePoint, but you're just not too sure how streamlined it is, how secure it is, things like that. So we can dedicate a particular workshop to that. And what we tend to find is that there's tons of opportunities to streamline the amount of sites that you have, the groups that you're using, and overall how the security is put together. So we'll work with you to create a permissions architecture and a matrix of how your SharePoint site should be set up and who should have access to what. And that's all fully then documented so you can use that going forward. We'll also talk about there's opportunities for hub site designs and things like that to make the most out of the functionality and features offered inside of SharePoint, or maybe it's a redesign that you're looking for your SharePoint. We can also talk about retention, so making sure that the right data is kept for a certain period of time, and the sensitivity labels that can be applied to those documents to make sure that only certain people have access to them. So to go one step further from what we've talked about, all of those permissions, all that security that we've just talked about is only relevant to when the documents live inside of SharePoint. Once they're extracted, if you download them or put them onto a pen drive or something like that, they're no longer protected. And that's where you need the sensitivity labels, which encrypt the documents at the document level. So if you want to go one step further, so if you've got some really sensitive data, mission critical, data that can't be leaked or end up in the hands of competitors, then reach out to us and we can talk to you about sensitivity labels to really make sure that your data is 100% bulletproof. As I say, at the time of recording, this workshop is £1,500. All the T's and C's, Valto reserve the right to periodically change their costs. Obviously, all of that applies. But at the time of recording, it's only £1,500. And this is a one-day workshop, which quite often nowadays we offer them remotely as well. And if they're remote, we can split them out into 2 half-day workshops for you as well to make sure you're getting the most of this time. But we also offer other workshops related to the Power Platform, including creating strategies, or if you're looking at building out a particular Power App, We can offer a development workshop. We also offer things like tenant-to-tenant migration. So a lot of people now, their organizations are merging with other organizations and they need help and support merging those two things together. We also offer disaster recovery and backup planning for Microsoft 365 and Azure, as well as dedicated Microsoft 365 specialist support. So this is something that we do over and above everybody else, is that we have dedicated Microsoft 365 specialists as a full managed support desk, first, second, third line support, with the likes of specialists in SharePoint, but also Power Apps, Power Platform, all of those different things. So if you're interested in any of those things, please do reach out to us today. You can do that by emailing hello@valto.co.uk and we'll get back to you. So if you do have any questions, I'm now going to leave this video running on silent for the next, say, 5 minutes or so. If you've got any questions at all, please use the comments feed below. We've got our experts standing by to answer any of your questions that you might have. If you want a copy of the slides, or you just want a 5-minute chat about any of these topics, again, email us at hello@valto.co.uk. We're now running our webinars on a monthly basis. We're running webinars based on SharePoint, Azure, Power Platform, business applications. So again, stay tuned and keep an eye out on our Eventbrite page for any upcoming webinars. Thank you very much for watching this video. As I say, we'll be standing by for the next 5 minutes answering any questions, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you.